Right, so we are going to start the chapter on chemical energy and ATP. This chapter, we're going to talk about cellular respiration, we'll talk about photosynthesis, and we'll talk about fermentation. So for this chapter in particular, you're going to want to be sure that you take some notes at home so that when you come to class, we're just kind of filling in the blanks rather than starting from scratch. So that's the nice thing about doing it on this platform. You can pause this, rewind it as many times as you want, and get whatever notes that you want. All right, so let's get started with 4.1. Again, it's chemical energy and ATP. And all cells are going to need chemical energy. So in the last chapter, towards the end of the last chapter, we talked about passive and active transport. And if you remember, when we talked about active transport, we said that that requires ATP. It requires the cell to actually supply some energy in order to do those functions. So the chemical energy used for most cell processes is carried by ATP. You're going to hear this acronym a lot. It's adenosine triphosphate. Molecules in food are going to store chemical energy in their bonds. So this top sketch that they've drawn here is supposed to be a sketch of a starch molecule, which we know is a carbohydrate. So this is the polymer carbohydrate. And this is also a glucose molecule down here, which is also a carbohydrate. Let's get these up here so you can look at them. ATP is going to transfer energy from the breakdown of food molecules to cell functions. So energy is released when a phosphate group is removed. So it's triphosphate, so it has 3 phosphates, triphosphate. So when one of these phosphates is removed, then the energy is going to be released during that event. And ADP, which is diphosphate, so 2-diphosphate is changed into triphosphate when a phosphate group is added. So energy is going to be released when one of these phosphates breaks away, which makes sense because it's triphosphate and it's going to lose a phosphate. That's what happened here. Phosphate broke away, energy has been released, and now it's adenosine diphosphate, which of course means 2. Di means 2. Then what is happening here is energy is being used to add a phosphate back, and that makes this then become triphosphate once again. So you start out at the top of that with triphosphate, then a phosphate is removed, energy is released, that leaves us with adenosine diphosphate, 2-diphosphate, and energy is then used to add a phosphate back in order to start that process again and to have a triphosphate. All right, so organisms are going to break down carbon-based molecules to produce ATP. So all organisms are going to need to break down things that are carbon-based, made of carbon, to produce this ATP to keep the cell moving, to keep things functioning. Carbohydrates are the molecules most commonly broken down to make this ATP. So that would be like the starch molecule we saw in the very first slide. This is not going to be stored in large amounts. The body, the organism is going to need to be constantly doing this process. It can use up to 36 ATP from one glucose molecule. So from just one glucose molecule, one sugar molecule, 36 ATP can be obtained. So again, this is just kind of emphasizing what I was saying earlier. Tri means 3. So the adenosine, that's this portion. Triphosphate, so don't hear these big words and get nervous. We just have to break it apart. Adenosine, triphosphate. That's what we started with at the top of the circle in the last slide. And it's going to become diphosphate as one of these phosphate groups breaks away. So this is diphosphate. Now, fats, even though we use a lot of carbohydrates to make to do this ATP process, fats are what store the most energy, right? So 80% of the energy in your body is from fat. And you can get 146 ATP from a triglyceride, which is a type of fat. So as you can see, that's much more than we were able to get from these carbohydrates, which were 36. So 36 ATP from a carbohydrate as opposed to 146 from a triglyceride. So a glucose versus a triglyceride. Proteins are least likely to be broken down to make ATP. Body doesn't tend to use them for that purpose, as amino acids aren't usually needed for the energy process. But in the case that it does happen, it has about the same amount of energy as a carbohydrate. So this lists those 3 macromolecules, if you remember that from chapter 2, macromolecules. The 4 macromolecules were carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. So the 3 here that we're talking about as far as being able to be used for energy, carbohydrates, you get 4 calories per milligram. Lipids, which are 9 calories per milligram, or proteins, which are 4 calories per milligram. So as you can see, fats are over twice as caloric as carbohydrates or proteins. And we say calorie, we think of calories as far as we're counting calories to be sure we don't gain weight or to help lose weight or something like that. But a calorie is really a unit of energy, and we'll talk more about that in class. So a few types of organisms do not need sunlight and photosynthesis as a source of energy. Some organisms are going to live in places that never get sunlight, like say deep in a cave or deep in the ocean or in a water-filled cave. In chemosynthesis, so now we're using chemicals, chemosynthesis, chemical energy is used to build carbon-based molecules. So they're going to use chemical energy rather than sunlight or solar energy. This process is going to be somewhat similar to photosynthesis, which we'll get into in the next section. It's going to use chemical energy, though, instead of light energy. So it's going to be similar to photosynthesis, similar to what plants do, but instead of using light energy or solar energy, it's going to use chemical energy. So this is just a picture of, well, it actually appears to be a water-filled cave. And that takes us to the end of 4.1. So that gives us a nice introduction into ATP, and be sure that you take good notes on this section and also on section 4.2 in order for us to go over these in class. Thank you.